Hi, Paul Arnold here, sometimes known as Studying Professor, and today I want to talk to you about selling creative work. And I see this to be as useful if you are working in the client end as if you are in the agency, because actually we all have to sell the work up the line. And actually, I think it's really important that we do sell work. I'll tell you why, because you know what, in a world full of actually averageness, we've really got to make work that stands out, and we've got to create brave work. It's very easy to sell safe work, but it's the most dangerous thing to do. So actually we've all got to be brave and we've all got to push it. It's difficult to sell good work, but it's ultimately very important. And in terms of your career, it's very important, because when you do sell work, it increases your respect and trust. And if you are coming to the table and you're failing to sell the work, then the trust and what's that judgment like is going to drop away. And don't think that if you're on the client side, you can hide behind, well, it was the agency, because the CMO is still going to be thinking, well, why did you bring it in front of me? Why didn't you make the judgment there? So actually, if we're coming forward with stuff, we've got to defend and we've got to sell that stuff. So I want to talk about this in actually 4 different camps. I want to talk about emotion of selling. I want to talk about the rationality of selling. I want to talk about some techniques. I want to talk about dealing with pushback. So let's take these in turn. Let's talk about emotion. Look, we all know we are emotional decision makers, and even in the very supposed rational B2B world, actually do not underestimate how important emotion is in making our decisions, even though we will post-rationalize what we're doing. And we all know the first thing is they buy you first. So actually we do need to spend a lot of time developing the quality of relationships we have with other people. But I think actually it's really important we understand them as well. 6 months in advance, you can start to be looking at what makes that person make the decisions they do. What are the sort of communication piece of work they like, do they not like? And likewise, understand what's at stake for them. A stakeholder has a stake, so what's at stake for them? And they're all really important to allow us that when we are presenting our work to whoever it is, we are presenting in a way that's fit for that particular person, or persons for that matter. The next thing about emotion is overcoming fear. And what you've got to remember is that most organizations, are operating in a place of the railroads of certainty. And what they're doing is they did what they did last year, this year slightly better. And what creativity absolutely breaks that, because creative by its very nature is novel. And by and large, if you live in a world of certainty, actually creativity is a real threat. And that's why it's easy to go and sell work that was like last year's work, because it's easy to buy. But actually we've got to challenge that. And we've got to overcome that initial fear, like, oh my God, what's this work like? And what we've got to do is we've got to be able to create a safe space for people to buy into. And we've got to surround it, and actually make sure that people feel that we are leading them to somewhere which is safe and not a dangerous place. And I always love that Chris Lowe poem about come to the edge, but we might fall, no, come to the edge. Because that conjures it up. We've got to be standing alongside and working with them to help make sure it feels super safe. And I think actually, the way you do that is a lot of by taking them through the work on a step-by-step place. So what we do is actually you take them through 3 or 4 different times, and the first thing you'll do is you'll take them through the brief itself. And then you'll take them through the idea, and I do a whole video about this idea about selling the idea first before we get into the execution. And then after that, you can talk about the big picture, and then you can present them, you can present it again, and then actually slowly they get to know the idea. And actually, you can then actually sort of then allow time afterwards to discuss it. And I always say that principle about through understanding comes acceptance. And the more you talk about it, the more likely they're really going to say, yeah, I see where you are. And you minimize and you mitigate the fear about it. And the other thing is, you've got to absolutely believe in the work. We've all heard of the phrase 55% of our communication comes from non-verbal language. If you don't believe in it, trust me, you are exuding out of you, I don't believe in this work. And, everyone will pick it up. I remember, I was working with a creator once to do some work for Gillette, and he presented me the work and wasn't quite sure about it, and he was very calm and very patient. We spent 1.5 hours talking about it, and eventually I got it. And the next day when I was presenting it to the client, and he was a bit unsure about it, and I said, Martin, where you are now is exactly where I was yesterday. And I explained it, and I was able to go and sell that in. And so you've really got to understand the idea inside out, back to front, because then you can really explain it. And you've got to spend time up front. If you do not, you're preparing yourself to fail, is that phrase that we talk about it. And I always think you've got to stand full square. I don't want you to go, well, this is what the creative director likes. No, you like it. If you don't like it, then actually, you shouldn't sell it. You should get someone else to go and sell it. Or actually, if there are real major concerns, you should have those battles out either with your agency or with your creative director. Get that sorted out first. And then actually often I suggest that if you can bring some theatre, not overly done theatre, but if you can to bring alive the key proposition. So I've done that with videos of the consumer target, anything to do that, to just bring a little bit of theatre, just to make sure that people feel it. And then they can believe it. That lovely case in the past about British Rail, being kept waiting in a dirty waiting room at an agency called Alan Brady Marsh, was a lovely example of demonstrating the fundamental issue that they were trying to resolve with their communications. So that's emotion. Now let's talk about rationality. And we do need to address this. So basically what I always say is you've got to sell this up. You've got to think about your client or your stakeholder. They've got to then sell it to the next level up. And actually the more you can ladder your story up, so therefore I think I can easily sell this to the next level up. And that's why we've got to remember that the reason we're doing communications fundamentally is because we're trying to drive the marketing objective. The marketing objective is there to try and drive the business objective. So the more we can sort of do this classic thing like, if we do this piece of communication, this is going to change our target audience perception of the brand. It's going to increase levels of trial at a higher price, lead to increased margin levels, increased dividends, etc. So actually we do need to do that. And that's why I always use the buy, and that's B-Y, not B-U-Y, which is the by doing this, by doing that, and it takes us up the line. And also, within this, I always say look, get the brief signed off by your stakeholder, because then it's a much easier sell, because then you say well, here was the brief you agreed to. There's your signature at the bottom. Here's the work. And as you see the two sit side by side, it makes it much more difficult to argue against it. And I always say that, you've got to construct your logic on 3 to 4 irrefutable pieces of evidence. Stuff that can't be, challenged, because then what you're doing, you are creating that whole sort of laddering of yes. And actually what you shouldn't do is you shouldn't then go, and there's this thing and there's that thing, because they become weaker pieces of evidence and they start to undermine you. So always go back, always stick on, no, let's go back to the top 3 things why we're doing this. Bang that, bang that, bang that. Can't challenge it. Stick on those things. And then I'll talk about selling the presuppositions, this idea about, you sell upon this, do we agree that that's important? Yes. Do we agree that's important? Do we agree that's important? Yes. Therefore, ipso facto, we must be doing this, is another way of doing that stuff. And also just don't oversell. Don't go and say oh, this is the very best work we've ever done. It just blows trust. I had one client who used to keep a note of all the cliches that the agency would come in with, and look, you've got to do it from a much gentler place. There's one great planner in town, and basically he always says that he sells the work half-baked. This idea that it's not completely finished yet. There are some things we want to work on, but it basically means that it's a much softer approach, and I quite liked that, what he was suggesting. And obviously, prepare some of the classic responses you're going to get. So if the brief asks you to deal with that secondary target audience, and it doesn't, you know, you've got to have your arguments about it. And I always suggest it's often useful to cover those issues up front. Because then say, now I know what you're thinking about how is this going to appeal to the millennials? Well, let me explain a bit about that. Well, once you've done that, you've taken that argument away from them, because then they say, yeah, but what about the sort of millennials? Well, very good point, John, but as you remember, I did talk about that early on, full stop, end of. Let's talk about some techniques. So I think actually, I always think it's where it works really well if you can sell the story behind the word. You know, that classic Don Draper type thing about I was sitting in this band and he said that and I came with an idea and that sort of, it really helps to engage people because people are by and large fascinated with the process of creativity. So I think selling the story behind the work is really useful. And also sell it against other work, that classic behavioral economics principle about contexting. You know, the more I see other pieces of work, the more I can sort of make a judgment, well, you know, that's a bad piece of work, that's not as good, this is the better piece. So always present it with 2 or 3 pieces, I think always helps. And I always suggest you chunk it down. To manage that fear and that anxiety, the more you involve them early and often, the better. Because then you're getting them involved in the idea and it's not one big, massive, big shock. You know, so maybe those tissue meetings are really quite useful and saying, look, they're thinking about this, unsure about that, you know, helps to sort of soften it when it comes through. And then the power of social norms, to be able to go back and say, look, you know, we've actually shared this with some consumers of this, who we know are in this group and they seem to quite like it, or other ways of doing that really helps to actually sell the stuff in. So let's deal with dealing with pushback. You know, this idea, you've got to have total sensory acuity. You've really got to listen hard to what they're saying and more important, maybe what they're not saying. So they're biting the lip and maybe they aren't as good at expressing it. And you've really got to challenge and say, like, how do you really feel about this, you know? And then I think you've got to like acknowledge, you know, where they are. Play back their words. You know, the great phrase about seek first to understand before being understood. You know, the NLP phrase, pace, 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 lead. This idea about once you can start saying, so I understand that from your perspective, you're worried about the size of the logo, or you're worried about the tonality. So yes, I absolutely, you know, for all the various reasons. And then you can then go in to say, well, let me explain a bit about why we think that is less of a worry here. And I always say, argue calmly. You know, that classic sort of physics principle about equal and opposite forces. The stronger you push something, the stronger you're going to get a resistance. Actually, do it gently. You know, that's the way to do it. And frankly, if you are at a point when you are at loggerheads, leave and come back another time. That's the best way to do it. So, you know, in that sense, you know, be prepared to lose the battle to win the war. And sometimes you just got to think, you know, they've got a point, let go of it, stuff like that. And the final point is just remember that the sell doesn't just end when the senior client says, yeah, that's good. Because the sell and defending the work has to go through the research, go through the budget, go through the filming, the editing, and also once you've aired it, or you put it out there in whatever form of media it's going into, the post evaluation of it is as important, and I've done a video about that. Anyway, I hope that helps. I obviously do loads of workshops in this field, so by all means, if that's of use to you, please contact me on the details at the end of this video. And enjoy the sell. Take care. Bye-bye.